The streetlights flickered outside, casting long shadows on the pavement, stretching them like ghosts against the dim glow of the evening. My hands trembled as I checked my phone again, the empty screen staring back at me, mocking me with its silence. The dinner I had spent an hour preparing sat cold on the table, the candles flickering lower, their soft glow doing little to ease the pit in my stomach. Mark was late. I had told myself it was work, that he had gotten caught up in another meeting, another call, another excuse, but the gnawing feeling in my gut refused to quiet down. Something was wrong. I checked the time again. 10:42 p.m. He should have been home hours ago. My fingers hovered over the call button, debating whether I should try him one more time, but then I saw them, headlights flashing across the driveway, his car slowing to a stop just before pulling in. My breath hitched in my throat as I stepped closer to the window, peering through the sheer curtain, my pulse hammering in my ears. He wasn't alone. A woman sat in the passenger seat, her silhouette partially obscured by the dim light, but the shape of her, the way she leaned toward him, sent ice crawling up my spine. I told myself it wasn't what it looked like, that maybe it was just a coworker, someone he was dropping off, but then I saw it. He turned to her, his movements slow, deliberate, like they had done this before. And then just like that, their lips met. The world around me blurred, my vision tunneling in on that one moment, the simple act that shattered everything in me all at once. This wasn't a friendly goodbye, not a mistake or an accident. This was intimate, familiar. The kind of kiss that belonged to a man who had nothing to hide. My fingers loosened, my phone slipping from my grasp and landing on the floor with a soft thud, but I barely heard it over the rush of blood in my ears. My breath came fast, shallow, my body screaming at me to do something. Throw open the door, confront him, demand answers, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot, watching my husband run his hand down her arm, his thumb brushing against her wrist in that absent-minded way he used to touch me. And then just as smoothly as it started, it was over. The woman pulled back, offering him a small smile, and then he shifted the car into drive and rolled forward into the driveway like nothing had happened. I barely had time to step away from the window before I heard the familiar sound of his keys in the front door, the creak of it swinging open, and then he was there, standing in the doorway, filling the space with his presence, his scent, his lies. "Hey babe," he said casually, as if his world hadn't just collided with mine and shattered it into pieces. He set his keys on the counter, walked up to me and kissed my cheek, the same lips that had just been on another woman's. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wouldn't break. Not yet. "You're late," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I expected, betraying nothing. "Yeah," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking every bit the man who had simply lost track of time. "Work ran over. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing my face into something resembling indifference. "Hungry. Starving." He pulled off his jacket, rolling his shoulders as he walked toward the dining table. "God, that smells amazing." I followed behind him, every movement mechanical, rehearsed, my mind still stuck in that moment outside. He sat, took a bite, hummed in satisfaction, completely at ease. My hands trembled as I picked up my fork, pushing food around my plate, forcing myself to chew when everything inside me screamed that nothing would ever taste the same again. He had kissed her and then he had come home and kissed me like it meant nothing. Or worse, like it wasn't a secret at all. The clock on the wall read 11:27 p.m. when I heard the familiar rumble of Mark's car pulling into the driveway, the headlights flashing briefly through the living room window before cutting out completely. I sat there, motionless, my fingers curled around the stem of a half-empty wine glass, my pulse thudding in my ears as I listened to the sound of his key turning in the lock. The door swung open and there he was, standing in the dim glow of the entryway, his tie loosened, his shirt slightly wrinkled, looking every bit the image of a man exhausted from a long day at the office. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying that casual ease he always had, the kind that would have reassured me once. "Sorry I'm late. Meetings ran over." He shrugged, setting his keys on the counter like it was just another normal night, like he hadn't just kissed another woman in the front seat of his car. My fingers tightened around the glass, but I kept my expression neutral, tilting my head just enough to study him, searching for cracks in his performance. "Long night?" I asked, keeping my voice even, controlled, as if I hadn't spent the last hour reliving that moment over and over again in my head, burning every second of it into my memory. He let out a tired sigh, rolling his shoulders back like the weight of the day still clung to him. Yeah. You know how it is. Some last-minute project came up and I couldn't get out of it. His explanation was smooth, effortless, but I wasn't the same woman I had been yesterday. I had seen the truth, and no matter how well he played his part, I knew now. Mark Carter was a liar. He walked past me toward the kitchen, opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, twisted the cap off with one hand and took a long drink, never once breaking his rhythm. He was too calm. Too composed. Too sure that I wouldn't question him. That's what got me. The certainty. The arrogance of it. You didn't call, I said, watching for the flicker, the momentary hesitation, anything that betrayed him. He turned back toward me, resting one arm against the counter, his brow furrowed just enough to feign surprise. Did I forget? Damn, I meant to text you. It was just so crazy at work, I barely looked at my phone. My stomach clenched as I nodded, my mind already racing ahead. If he had barely looked at his phone, then there should have been messages, notifications, missed calls. Something. But when I walked past him, heading toward the hallway where he had tossed his jacket over the chair, my pulse kicked up, my hands already itching to find what I knew wasn't there. His phone. No texts. No calls. No emails. Nothing. It was wiped clean. A blank slate. Too blank. My breath hitched for just a second, the realization hitting me like a cold slap. He had deleted everything. No one does that unless they have something to hide. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself not to react, not to show him that I knew, that I saw through him, that this game he was playing, whatever it was about to change. Instead, I walked past the chair, past his jacket, into the bedroom and sat down at my desk, my fingers hovering over the trackpad of my laptop. If his phone was wiped, maybe I could find something else. I opened my emails, scanning through the messages, my heart hammering, my eyes flicking from subject to subject, looking for something, anything that didn't belong. And then I saw it. A document. One I hadn't opened, hadn't created, hadn't touched. It was a simple text file, nothing flashy, just a name buried in a sea of ordinary work files. But when I clicked it open, my stomach turned to ice. A conversation. King Mark. Tom. She's still holding up. Longer than I thought. Give it time. Everyone breaks. My breath left me in a slow, shaking exhale. My vision tunneled, my pulse a steady roar in my ears. What the hell was I looking at? This wasn't about work. This wasn't about a late meeting or some innocent misunderstanding. This was something else. Something worse. A test. A game. A plan. My fingers trembled as I scrolled, reading every word, every line, trying to piece together the edges of whatever twisted reality I had just stepped into. She's still holding up. Holding up against what? Everyone breaks. What did that mean? Who was I supposed to be in this? The victim? The participant? The fool? My hands curled into fists as I shut the laptop, my mind racing, my heartbeat an erratic mess of adrenaline and panic. Whatever this was, whatever they were planning, I was done being in the dark. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, thick with something unseen, something crawling beneath my skin like a warning. My fingers hovered over the small flash drive I had just pulled from the inner pocket of Mark's briefcase, my heart slamming against my ribs as if it already knew what I was about to see. I shouldn't have found it. I shouldn't have been looking. But the moment I saw it tucked away, buried under meaningless receipts and folded notes, I knew. It wasn't meant to be found. The laptop's screen glowed in the dim light of the bedroom, casting sharp shadows across my face as I inserted the drive, my stomach twisting into knots, my pulse a deafening drumbeat in my ears. A single file. No name, no date, just a video. I clicked it open. The grainy footage flickered to life, the camera angle shaky at first before settling on two familiar figures sitting in a dimly lit room. Mark. Tom. Their voices were low, casual, threaded with amusement. She's still holding up, Mark said, leaning back, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand like he was discussing the weather. Tom laughed, shaking his head. You expected her to break this fast? No, Mark admitted, his smirk sharp, knowing. But everyone breaks eventually. The walls closed in around me, the sound of my own breath suddenly too loud, too ragged. My hand flew to my mouth as the words sank in, poisoning every memory, every soft moment I had ever shared with him. He wasn't just lying to me. He was testing me. Watching. Waiting. Like I was some kind of experiment. The video ended abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I snapped the laptop shut, my body rigid, my hands curled into fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. My marriage wasn't real. My pain wasn't real. My love, my trust, none of it mattered. It was all a game. And I was done playing. The bar was packed, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses spilling out onto the street, masking the pounding in my chest as I slid into the dimly lit space, my eyes immediately locking onto him. Mark sat in a booth near the back, Tom at his side, their heads tilted toward each other, drinks in hand. They were relaxed, comfortable, the same way they had been in that video. My hands shook as I made my way toward them, slipping into the crowd, staying just out of sight. Their laughter rang out over the music, effortless, easy. "She's still keeping it together," Tom said, shaking his head with a grin. "I gotta admit, I thought she'd crack sooner." Mark smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Give it time." My blood ran cold. My skin burned. My vision tunneled in on the two of them, their words twisting inside me like a knife, each syllable cutting deeper, tearing apart the last shred of the woman who had once believed in them. The anger hit me so fast, so violently, that I barely felt myself moving. My eyes darted around the bar until they landed on a familiar face, Jake. He was standing by the counter, a drink in hand, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on me. His brows furrowed in concern, but before he could speak, I moved. My steps were steady, deliberate, my heart pounding as I closed the distance between us. He barely had time to react before my hand was on his chest, before I leaned up and crushed my lips against his. His body stiffened in shock, but I didn't pull away. I needed this. I needed to burn through the ice in my veins, to do something reckless, something that was mine. Just for me. The moment I broke the kiss, I felt it. The shift in the air. The weight of someone's stare burning into my skin. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I met Mark's gaze from across the room. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He didn't even look surprised. He just smiled. A slow, knowing smile, like a man watching his plan unfold exactly as he expected. He leaned toward Tom, murmuring something, and then laughed. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't me taking control. This was exactly what he wanted. And I had played right into his hands. Mark didn't react the way I expected, not even close. There was no outburst, no anger, no jealousy flickering behind his eyes as he watched me kiss Jake in the middle of that crowded bar. Instead, he just smiled, slow, deliberate, the kind of expression that wasn't born out of surprise but certainty. It sent a chill through me, a gnawing unease that rooted itself deep in my gut as he leaned back, whispered something to Tom, and took a sip of his drink like he had seen it all coming. The air around me tightened, the rush of adrenaline I had felt only moments ago curdling into something colder, something darker. I had wanted to hurt him, to break through that carefully curated facade, but instead I felt like the one who had just walked into a trap. When he finally stood, his movements were easy, unhurried, his steps measured as he crossed the room toward me. My pulse hammered in my throat, but I forced myself to hold my ground, to meet his gaze without flinching. "Nice to see you enjoying yourself," he murmured, his voice so calm it only made my skin crawl more. "Did you have fun?" The question was a test, a move I hadn't anticipated, and the smug amusement in his tone made my fists clench. "I don't owe you an explanation," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle he had already solved but was enjoying the process of watching me try to piece myself together. "No," he agreed, setting his empty glass down on the bar with a quiet clink. "You don't." That was it. No accusations. No accusations of betrayal, no venom laced in his words. Just a statement, cool and calculated, like he was giving me just enough rope to hang myself with. My frustration simmered under my skin, my breath uneven as I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "What is this, Mark?" His lips twitched, barely a reaction at all, but I caught it. "This," he said, voice light, as if we were talking about something as trivial as the weather, "is still just beginning." A shiver ran down my spine at the weight of those words, but before I could press him, before I could demand the answers I so desperately needed, he turned and walked away. I stood frozen in place, my heart slamming against my ribs, watching him disappear into the night like none of this mattered, like I was the only one stuck in the chaos he had created. The drive to Lisa's house felt longer than usual, the silence pressing down on me, filling the spaces in my mind with every unanswered question, every loose thread I couldn't tie together. My sister opened the door, her expression shifting into concern the second she saw my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I sank onto her couch, rubbing my temples, my exhaustion catching up to me all at once. "I don't know what's real anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa sat across from me, waiting, patient, the way she always was when she thought I was spiraling over nothing. I told her everything. The video, the bar, the way Mark had looked at me like he wasn't surprised at all, like he had wanted me to kiss Jake. Her brows knitted together, but she didn't look shocked. Instead, she sighed, shaking her head. "Sarah, you're overthinking this," she said gently. "You've always had a tendency to let your imagination get the best of you." My stomach twisted. "I'm not imagining this. A man doesn't just sit back while his wife kisses another guy unless he's already moved on," she reasoned, her voice laced with the kind of rationality I would have believed if I didn't already know better. "Maybe that's it, maybe he just—" "No," I cut her off, my hands tightening into fists. "This isn't just about him cheating. This is something else. Something planned." Lisa gave me a sympathetic look, the kind that made me feel small, made me feel ridiculous, like I was grasping at shadows. "You're paranoid," she said, and the words cut deeper than I expected. "And honestly, can you blame him for acting distant? You kissed Jake, Sarah." My stomach lurched. She wasn't hearing me. Or worse, she was, and she just didn't care. The drive home felt heavier, like I was dragging something unseen with me, something dark curling around my mind, whispering the things I didn't want to admit. Mark had led me here, every step carefully placed, every reaction or lack thereof, measured and controlled. He wasn't just playing a game. He was winning. I just didn't know what the prize was yet. The night air was thick with the scent of rain on pavement, the distant hum of the city blending into the quiet tension between us as we stood in the alley behind the bar. The echo of my heartbeat pounded in my ears, my mind still caught in the moment I had walked straight into Mark's trap. His knowing smirk still burned into my thoughts like a brand I couldn't shake. But here, away from the weight of his gaze, there was only Jake, watching me with something I couldn't quite name, something deeper than concern, heavier than simple curiosity. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something just beneath the surface, something real. I exhaled slowly, crossing my arms against the chill creeping into my skin, against the realization that I had no idea what I was up against. "Careful of what?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the street like he was weighing whether to say it out loud, like speaking it would make it worse. "Mark," he finally said. "He's not who you think he is." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were shocking but because I had already started to believe them before he even said them out loud. "You know something," I pressed, stepping closer, searching his face for answers he wasn't giving me. He hesitated, his fingers flexing at his sides before he let out a slow breath, like he had been holding it in for too long. "I know what it's like to watch him get everything he wants," he admitted, his voice quieter now, like he was confessing something he never meant to say. "I've been watching for years." My pulse stuttered, a different kind of tension settling between us, something raw, something I should have seen before but never let myself acknowledge. "Jake," I started, but he shook his head. "If it wasn't for him, Sarah..." His voice trailed off, but I didn't need him to finish the sentence. "If it wasn't for Mark, things between us would have been different. He wouldn't have been just a friend, just a familiar presence in the background of my life." I felt it then, the way he was looking at me, the way my body responded before my mind could catch up. He took a slow step closer, the space between us vanishing, his breath warm against my skin, his hand lifting just slightly like he was going to touch me, like he wanted to but was waiting for me to decide. My heart slammed against my ribs, my body torn between the pull toward him and the weight of everything else pressing down on me, everything unraveling inside me, everything I still didn't understand. He leaned in just enough for me to feel the heat radiating off him, for me to see the way his lips parted, the hesitation flickering in his eyes. And for one fleeting second I thought about letting it happen. I thought about closing the distance, about forgetting everything except the way I suddenly wanted this, the way I wanted to feel something that wasn't manipulation, wasn't doubt, wasn't Mark. But then reality crashed down hard, fast, suffocating. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but it was enough. His expression shifted, something sad and understanding passing over his face. But he nodded, stepping back just slightly, giving me space I wasn't even sure I wanted. "Not yet," he murmured, like he already knew this wasn't the end of whatever this was. The uncertainty burned through me, settling deep in my chest as I turned away, but the damage was already done. Because for the first time I felt it. The first real break inside me, the first shift, the first undeniable truth. I wasn't just losing my trust in Mark. I was losing myself too. The world was already tilting, already unraveling, already slipping through my fingers faster than I could grasp it, but this was different. This was worse. This was the moment I realized I had never been fighting against just Mark. I had never been alone in this web. Lisa had been there too, tangled in the same strands, but instead of trying to pull me out, she had helped him spin them tighter. My hands shook as I scrolled through the messages on her phone, my breath coming too fast, too shallow, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. Her name side by side with his, the words threading together like needles, sewing my reality shut with every line. "She's close." "Not yet. You need to keep her steady. She's already questioning everything." That's the point. My stomach twisted violently, a cold rush of betrayal slamming into me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs, making my fingers go numb as I tightened my grip on her phone, as if crushing it could somehow erase what I had just seen. I looked up, my vision narrowing, my pulse roaring in my ears as I met her eyes across the kitchen, the warmth in them suddenly feeling manufactured, like a mask I had never noticed before. "How long?" My voice was too even, too steady, but I felt the cracks forming beneath the surface, the tremble threatening to break through. Lisa blinked, her lips parting slightly before pressing together again, like she was debating whether to lie or to try to soften the truth. "Sarah, how long?" I snapped, slamming the phone onto the counter between us, the sound slicing through the air like a gunshot. She flinched, but only for a second. Then, just like Mark, she exhaled slowly, controlled, measured. "It's not what you think." A bitter laugh ripped from my throat before I could stop it, something ugly and broken twisting inside me. "Not what I think?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You've been working with him. You've been part of this, whatever this is, behind my back. How is that not exactly what I think?" She hesitated, and for the first time I saw it. The hesitation. The flicker of uncertainty. The realization that she had underestimated how much I had already figured out. "It was just a test," she finally said, and the words felt like knives, like poison, like a final nail in a coffin I hadn't even realized was mine. A test. My voice cracked, my nails digging into my palms so hard it hurt. "A test for what, Lisa?" "I can't." "No," I cut her off, stepping closer, the betrayal burning so hot in my chest I could barely breathe. "You don't get to back out now. What were you testing?" She swallowed, but she didn't answer, and that silence, that hesitation, was worse than any lie she could have told me. The kitchen felt too small, the walls pressing in, the weight of everything crushing down on me, and then suddenly, another voice cut through the air, another presence stepping into the scene I hadn't realized had an audience. "You were supposed to break sooner," Tom said from the doorway, his voice casual, almost amused, like he had just made some offhand observation about the weather. My head snapped toward him, my entire body going rigid, every muscle locking into place as his words settled over me like a death sentence. "What?" His smirk wavered just for a second, just enough for me to see it. The mistake. The moment he realized he had said too much. Lisa's face paled beside me, but she didn't look at me. She looked at him. And that told me everything I needed to know. "Tom," she said sharply, a warning hidden beneath her name, but it was too late. He ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling heavily, shaking his head like he was suddenly frustrated with himself. "It doesn't matter now," he muttered, more to himself than to us, before finally meeting my eyes. "The point is, Sarah, this was never about catching you. It was about watching you fall apart." A cold sweat broke over my skin, my breath hitching, my legs unsteady beneath me, because I realized in that moment, I had been asking the wrong questions all along. It wasn't about why they were testing me. It wasn't about when it had started. It wasn't even about who was involved anymore. The only question left was the one I had never considered before. What happens when I finally break? The moment I stepped back from that conversation, from the sickening realization that Lisa and Tom had been part of this all along, something inside me shifted. I had spent too much time reacting, Too much time being a pawn in a game I didn't understand, but now I saw it for what it was. I wasn't supposed to find out, not this soon, not like this. They had been waiting for me to crumble, for me to reach a breaking point, but instead of breaking, I made a decision. If they wanted to play, I'd play. But this time I wouldn't be the one left in the dark. I wiped my face, steadied my breath, let the betrayal settle deep in my bones, not as a wound but as a weapon. Then I forced a slow, bitter smile, turned back to Lisa, and let my voice drop into something lighter, something unexpected. Fine, I said, my tone so even it made her flinch. Let's see how this plays out. Her eyes flickered with something close to confusion, maybe even fear, but I didn't give her a chance to question it. I had bigger things to do. Mark was waiting when I got home, leaning casually against the kitchen counter, a glass of whiskey in hand, looking as if he had expected me all along. The sight of him, so calm, so unbothered, made my stomach churn, but I kept my mask in place, stepping toward him with a sigh, like a woman exhausted from chasing ghosts. I know, I said simply, watching for any flicker of surprise, but there was none. He just raised an eyebrow, took a slow sip and smiled. And what exactly do you think you know? His voice was smooth, inviting, like he was daring me to unravel, like he was waiting for the explosion. I held his gaze, forced my body to relax and shrugged. That this isn't about cheating. That it never was. His expression didn't change, but I saw the small shift in his posture, the way his fingers tightened just slightly around his glass. It was the first real confirmation I had gotten. I stepped closer, lowering my voice, testing the waters of my new role in this game. So tell me, Mark, what is it you're really waiting for? He chuckled under his breath, setting the glass down, stepping just close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. His voice was almost amused, almost affectionate, and for a second I felt the weight of how deeply he enjoyed this. I forced a smirk, tilting my head. Try me. But he only shook his head, ran a hand through his hair and smiled. It's still too soon. The weight of his words sat heavy on my shoulders as I drove, my fingers gripping the wheel too tight, my mind replaying every single moment of this nightmare on a loop. Mark wasn't worried, not even a little. Because he thought he still had control. Because he thought I was still playing by his rules. I needed another perspective, someone who wasn't already tangled in this web. I needed Jake. He was waiting when I pulled up, leaning against his truck, arms crossed, watching me with the same concern he always did. I barely made it out of the car before he spoke. Sarah, what the hell is going on? I shook my head, exhaling sharply, trying to force words out that didn't even make sense in my own mind yet. It's not just an affair, I admitted, my voice raw, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline of keeping my mask in place. It's something else. His face hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. I know, he muttered, looking away for a second like he was deciding whether to tell me something. I've been trying to figure it out for a while. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? He hesitated, then finally met my gaze, his voice low. I don't think you were ever meant to be his wife, Sarah. I think you were meant to be his experiment. The words hit me like ice water, like a sudden drop into something I hadn't been prepared for, something deeper than I realized. My entire body tensed, my heart hammering, my mind racing with the weight of what he was implying. Experiment. Yes. A controlled outcome. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, the fear and rage curling into something sharper, something dangerous. Jake studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. You turn it around on him. The idea settled in my mind like wildfire, spreading, taking shape, forming something solid and real. They had been waiting for me to break. But what if I made them think I already had? What if I gave them exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected? The game was about to change. And this time I would be the one pulling the strings. The restaurant buzzed with conversation, laughter rolling off the walls like background noise, but all I could hear was the steady, controlled beat of my own pulse as I stepped inside, my hand resting lightly on Jake's arm. The warm lighting softened the edges of the perfectly set tables, the polished silverware glinting under the glow of the chandeliers, but none of it mattered. Not the food, not the people, not the carefully orchestrated atmosphere designed to make everything feel normal. Nothing was normal. Not tonight. Not anymore. I felt the shift the second we walked in, the way Mark's eyes found me from across the room, his expression unreadable, his body language too relaxed, too still, like he had been expecting this, like he had been waiting for me to make my next move. My skin burned under his gaze, but I didn't falter. Instead, I leaned into Jake just enough to make it clear, just enough to let my fingers brush against his, just enough to let Mark see exactly what I wanted him to see. A flicker of amusement passed through his features, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips before he turned back to his drink, uninterested. Unbothered. Like he had already won. Dinner passed in a haze of forced small talk, of glasses clinking and plates being cleared, of Mark sitting at the far end of the table, his posture easy, his expression unreadable, like he was watching a show he had already seen before. He never looked angry. Never tense. Never the way I wanted him to look. He just waited. And then when the moment was right, I made my move. The conversation lulled, a brief pause settling over the table, and without hesitation, without allowing myself time to second-guess, I turned to Jake. My hand found his jaw, my body angling toward him, and before I could think, before I could let fear stop me, I kissed him. Right there. In front of everyone. The world tilted, the air shifting, the weight of it all pressing down on my chest, and then just as smoothly as it started, it was over. My heart pounded as I pulled back, my breath caught somewhere between my ribs, my hands trembling under the table, but I didn't dare look away. The silence stretched, suffocating, everyone at the table frozen, waiting, but I only cared about one thing. Mark. He set his drink down with a soft clink, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and stood. Slow. Deliberate. His gaze never left mine as he adjusted his cufflinks, rolling his shoulders like he was settling into something inevitable. Then, in that calm, measured voice that had always unnerved me more than his anger, he said, "Now you've passed the test." A cold, sharp blade of confusion sliced through my chest, my breath catching, my pulse stuttering. He tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something triumphant. "You thought I was cheating?" he asked, his voice almost amused, almost affectionate. "No, Sarah. I never needed to. I just wanted to see when you would." The blood drained from my face, my body going rigid, my hands curling into fists against my lap as the weight of his words settled over me like cement. The air thickened, the murmurs around the table barely registering as my mind raced, trying to process, trying to make sense of the ground shifting beneath me. "What?" I forced the word out, but it barely sounded like mine. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to let his voice drop lower, just enough for only me to hear. "I was never testing my own loyalty," he said, his tone casual, almost playful. "I was testing yours." The room spun, my vision narrowing, my stomach twisting into something sharp and painful as the reality of it all crashed down on me, faster than I could keep up. He had never been watching to see if I'd catch him. He had been watching to see when I'd crack. When I'd break. When I'd fall into the exact trap he had laid out for me from the beginning. My breath came short, shallow, my chest tightening as I forced myself to hold his gaze, to push past the nausea twisting inside me. My hands shook, but I didn't move. My entire body screamed at me to do something, to yell, to slap him, to storm out. But I stayed frozen, stuck between fury and disbelief, between the unbearable urge to destroy him and the cold, suffocating realization that I had just walked straight into his endgame. I had kissed Jake, and now I was exactly where he wanted me. My choice was clear. I could keep playing, or I could burn the whole thing to the ground. The room still buzzed with the aftermath of Mark's words, the weight of his manipulation pressing against my chest like a vice, but I refused to let it crush me. My mind moved too fast, my breath too shallow, my heartbeat a steady drum of fury in my ears. He thought he had won. He thought he had backed me into a corner, tied my hands, left me with no options except to accept his game and let him walk away victorious. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated me. My fingers curled around my phone inside my bag, the cool weight of it grounding me as I forced my face into something unreadable, my pulse a relentless, pounding rhythm of control. I exhaled slowly, lifted my chin, and met his gaze with something dangerous, something final. Then without a word I pressed play. The sound of his own voice filled the room, cutting through the murmurs, the clinking glasses, the false warmth of polite conversation. The laughter was the first thing they heard. Mark's voice, rich with amusement, tinged with arrogance, the same laugh he had given me so many times before. "She's still holding up," his voice said through the speaker, smooth, controlled, like a man with the world in his hands. "Longer than I thought, honestly." Pause. Then Tom's voice, lower, entertained. "You expected her to crack this fast?" Another chuckle. "No, Mark admitted. But everyone breaks eventually. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the table, the air turning heavy with realization, with shock, with the slow dawning horror of what they had just heard. Eyes flickered between me and him, confusion and disgust creeping into their faces. The perfect illusion Mark had built beginning to fracture under the weight of the truth. For the first time since this all started, I saw it, the moment he lost control. His jaw tightened, his body going rigid, his fingers twitching slightly against the edge of the table. The mask cracked, just enough for me to see the raw, unfiltered anger beneath it, the sharp edge of panic creeping into his carefully composed exterior. He had been so certain that he would always be 3 steps ahead, so confident in his ability to manipulate me, but now the game had shifted. Now he was on the defensive. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low, sharp. "Sarah." Just my name, but laced with warning, with a silent command to stop, to back down, to remember who he was and who I had been before all of this. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Something wrong, Mark?" Before he could answer, before he could summon the calm, unshaken version of himself that he always relied on, Lisa's breath hitched beside me. Her eyes were wide, darting between us, her hand gripping the stem of her wine glass so tight her knuckles went white. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice shaking, her body trembling under the weight of her own guilt. "I swear, Sarah, I didn't know he'd go this far." The words barely registered, barely cut through the white noise of rage and betrayal roaring inside me, because it didn't matter anymore. Nothing she said could undo what she had been a part of. Nothing she did could rewrite the fact that she had stood by and watched while I unraveled, while I questioned my own sanity, while I drowned in the confusion of a world that had never been real to begin with. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of it against the floor sounding final, deafening. I felt their eyes on me, the weight of their shock, their shame, their silent pleas for me to stay, to fight, to salvage something from the ruins they had left behind. But I was done fighting. I was done playing. I was done. I met Mark's gaze one last time, letting him see it, letting him understand before I even said the words. The end. The part of the game he had never expected. The moment he lost. "You wanted to see when I would break?" I said softly, my voice steady, unwavering. "Congratulations. You did it." Then I turned and walked away, leaving them to sit in the wreckage of their own creation, leaving behind whatever love I had once had for him, whatever trust one had foolishly placed in my sister, leaving behind the woman they had thought they could control. I didn't need to stay to know that Mark was watching me go, that his mind was racing, calculating, scrambling for a way to pull me back in. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. Because this time I wasn't the one who was breaking. This time I was the one walking away from the fire. The knock on my door came later than I expected, but I knew it would come. I stood there for a moment, fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter, my breath steady, my heart quiet. The storm inside me had already passed, leaving nothing but the wreckage of what once was, the remains of a game I refused to play any longer. I turned the handle, already knowing who it would be. Mark stood in the dim glow of the porch light, his face set in something that might have passed for regret if I didn't know better. His tie was loosened, his eyes heavy, but there was no real remorse in them, just the remnants of a man who thought he could still talk his way out of anything. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, stepping forward, his voice measured, careful, like he thought the right words could still fix this. "I just needed to know." I didn't respond, didn't move, didn't give him anything. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening as he searched for the angle, for the move that would undo everything. "It was never about betrayal, Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "It was about certainty. I needed to be sure. I needed to know that if everything fell apart, if life got hard, if things changed, you would never leave me. That you would always be mine." His words should have hurt. Maybe a part of me wanted them to. But there was nothing left inside me to wound. I studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting him see the woman he had underestimated, the one who had already left him long before she walked out of that restaurant. "You needed to be sure?" I repeated, tilting my head just slightly, watching the way his throat bobbed, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. "And now you are." He exhaled, reaching for me like he had any right to touch me, but I stepped back before he could. His eyes darkened for just a second, just long enough for me to see it, to catch the flicker of frustration at losing something he thought he could keep. But then it was gone, replaced with that same calculated patience. "I still love you," he said, but there was no weight behind it, no depth, just a final attempt to pull me back into a place I had no intention of returning to. A car pulled up behind him, headlights flashing for a second before shutting off. I knew who it was before I even saw him. Jake leaned against the driver's side door, watching, waiting, not pushing, just being there. Mark's jaw tensed, but he didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, like he wasn't worth his attention. "You don't have to do this," Mark murmured, his voice low now, private, like this was still just between us. "You don't have to leave." I let out a slow breath, stepping forward this time, closing the space between us, watching as his expression shifted into something almost hopeful, something desperate. I lifted my hand to his jaw, just the way I had done so many times before, let my fingers trace the familiar lines of his face, and then just as slowly I leaned in. His breath hitched, his hands hovering at my sides like he didn't know if he should touch me. And then I kissed him. It wasn't love. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anything but an ending. A goodbye pressed into his lips, a final nail in the coffin of what we had once been. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't pull away. Not until I did. When I stepped back, he was frozen, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite name, something between understanding and rage. But it didn't matter anymore. I had already turned away. I walked past him, toward Jake, toward the car, toward whatever came next. I didn't look back, not when I reached for the door handle, not when I stepped inside. Not even when I heard the sound of something shattering behind me, the sharp, broken crash of something being knocked from the porch, something small, something fragile. I didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The chess set. The same one he had always kept by the door, the one he used to run his fingers over absent-mindedly, the one he had treated with the same patience, the same strategy, the same control he had once tried to use on me. The game was over. And I was finally free.